Boirun, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everybody to part 2 of a very special series on Sephardic Judaism in Republican Turkey. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for La Hermandad Sephardi de America, the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities in the United States. And we're proud to present this program tonight as a part of our brand new Sephardic Digital Academy, a national partnership initiative with many other of our communities around the country, with amazing rabbis, scholars, educators, Ladino linguists, and so many others. If you're ever interested in finding out more about any of our wonderful classes, whether it be history, cooking, and so much more, please feel free to find out more at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. We're so excited to have Nesi with us tonight. Nesi Altaras, a native of Istanbul's Sephardic and Ladino-speaking community, is currently an MA student in political science at McGill University, a member of the shrinking, sometimes, Jewish community of Turkey. Nesi is a writer and editor for the online Jewish publication Avlaremos, and his current research is on immigration of Jews from Kurdistan in the final years of the Ottoman Empire. His previous work was on the failed peace and reconciliation processes in Turkey on the Kurdish question. His interest is in minorities in both contemporary Middle East and late Ottoman history, as well as identity in modern day Turkey. Nesi, we're so happy and thankful to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'll start the presentation. So today we're gonna pick up from the transition in Turkey to what sometimes people call the Second Republic, which is when the government decided to allow the formation of a second party. So that's where we'll start from. So what we talked about last week was the one-party republic that went from the formation of the country to 46. Today we're going to talk about the formation of the Democrat Party and its government, mass migration to Palestine, the coups, and the decline of Ladino that's happening in this process. And we're going to end in 1980 with the coup of 1980. So the period we're looking at is mostly shaped by two events that Jews simply cannot shake. When we come to 1946, we're talking about a community that experienced the wealth tax and basically would remember this event for the rest of their lives. The people who were affected by it lost their homes, businesses, sometimes their lives. Many had to serve in a forced labor camp in Eastern Turkey. And what we see right afterwards is that the politicians responsible are unapologetic. We see President İnönü saying this order was given by the conscience of the nation, this order being the wealth tax. And Saraçoğlu, who was the prime minister at the time, was also quite supportive of his idea afterwards, saying with this law, we'll take the market away from the dominant minority traders and give the Turkish market to the Turks, once again underlining the Turkish nationalism's exclusive creation. And basically, these leaders continue ruling the country, and the ruling party, the CHP, the CHP. So the Jews become really antagonistic to this party. And then when in 1946 another party starts forming, they immediately flock to its side, and they start calling İnönü, or they had been calling İnönü El Sodro, because he was partially deaf. So we're going into this period of Jews saying Ya basta El Sodro, we're done with, enough with the deaf man. And the other thing that is shaping the ideas about the CHP in this period, the ruling party, is the Labor Battalions that started in 1941. So we didn't have time to get into this last time, but this is happening right before the wealth tax. Basically, this event, also called the Nafa, or the 20 Kura soldiers affair is the taking of non-Muslim men from 18 up to 45 into recruitment as free labor for the Ministry of Public Works. And this is under the guise of the military, but none of these people are being given military training. They're not being given arms of any kind. They're mostly not even being recruited during the winter. So they're just being recruited to do work on roads from Izmir to Adana and Izmir to Yozgat. And they don't get paid. And they're oftentimes being recruited for a second time after already having served. So you see sons and fathers serving together, supposedly as their military service, but actually they're just being used as free labor. And this picture is of non-Muslim free laborers who are working on a road project in Yozgat in 1942. So the traumas of these two events, the wealth tax and the labor battalions, is really what makes the CHP so anathema to the Jewish public and makes the Democrat Party into such a hope. So in this period, we're talking about Turkey becoming a founding member of the United Nations, trying to become a part of the Western Alliance that is forming in the incipient Cold War, and trying to pose itself as a modernizing, liberal democratic country. So the government of CHP recognizes that to be such a country, there must be opposition. So they allow for the formation of this party led by Adnan Menderes and Celal Bayar. In 1946, they contest the elections. They're not particularly free or fair, and the CHP keeps government, but the Democrat Party becomes a strong opposition. And in 1950, they take power, and they overwhelmingly do so. This brings quite a lot of change, and the Jews are very supportive of all of this. In his memoirs of the period, Eli Shaul, a dentist, says that being a Jew meant being a DP supporter, that all the Jews simply flocked to the Democrat Party side, especially because of the recent trauma of the wealth tax and the labor battalions. And during their campaign, the DP used this to their advantage, and they make promises of a possible return of the wealth tax, which is the news item here. They call it out as a racist policy that should have never happened. And recognizing this, the CHP is also trying to become more pro-minority, more pro-equality at the time, but it doesn't really fool the Jewish public or the Jewish elites, who are all stacked against the CHP at this time. So in 1945, the government actually starts allowing non-Muslims to attend military academies so that they can become officers. But this doesn't really fix anything in the public's imaginary. We also see in this time, after the CHP comes to power in 1950, that Islam is becoming more of a cultural and social touchstone in politics, when it was kind of shoved to the side in the one-party period. But this also doesn't really dampen Jewish support for the Democrat Party. For example, the party brings to power Jews themselves who take places in parliament and in local assemblies in the municipal government. And the first one of these is Salomon Adalto, a very important person for our talk today. He first gets into parliament in 1946 as a representative of Istanbul, and then again in 1950. And he calls out the wealth tax as a member of the DP. It says, the notorious wealth tax destroyed our homes, and the CHP dirtied our pure feelings for the nation when we were called to the national service. Because they gave us axes and shovels in place of guns, instead of training us like soldiers, they had us dig dirt. So we clearly see the resentment towards the CHP for the wealth tax and the labor battalions. And this is what's shaping the Jewish public's opinion of the government and also of their country and the society they're living in as antagonistic to them. previously to this period, there had been a few Jews who were appointed by Ataturk to be in parliament, but in that one-party parliament, they weren't really allowed to say such things, or they wouldn't even dare. But Salomon Adato, as a member of parliament, is not only a person who's a DP supporter, but also there as a representative of his own community, which is a major change for Jews in Turkey. And he's not the only one. In 54, we see Hanji Soriano, a Jewish communal leader, join the DP as a parliamentarian and be elected. We see Yusuf Salman in 1957. We see Isacc Altaras in 1957 as well. And these people become staples of the party, which also has Armenian and Greek origin representatives. But Jews of the minorities become the strongest DP supporters. While the other communities are majority DP supporters, but divided, Jews are squarely against the CHP and in favor of the DP. But in this time, we still see that the structure of the national state, it isn't changing. So the DP doesn't actually solve the Jewish problems. The assimilationist requirements, especially in terms of language, keep continuing. These people, these representatives, still use phrases such as, there are no minorities, they're just Turkish citizens, to try to erase the distinctiveness and basically get over differences and try to pretend we're all similar. And then this shoos away the realities that Jewish communal life has been clamped down and that it's been suppressed. For example, Munis Tekinalp, who we've mentioned last time, becomes a candidate for parliament for the CHP and says that he would not even be a Jewish deputy. He would be simply a person working for the best for the Turkish nation, who just happens to be Jewish. And that's kind of the outlook of a lot of these people. But we still see people of this group raising a Jewish voice. For example, here we see Yusuf Salman of the DP, who as a member for parliament say, during the time of the CHP government, members of minorities were in fear. So this is showing that the Turkish public sphere is really changing from a strictly one-party, no freedom place to one where, within some boundaries, everyone, including minorities, can express their opinion in the press. And throughout this time, we see the relationship between the DP and Jews peak. So in this picture, we see the president, who was Celal Bayar, visiting the Ora Hayim annual ball for the benefit of the Ora Hayim hospital in Balat. So that's him, the president, Samuel Abravaya of the community, and here is Mr. Gunsberg, who's a dentist in the community, and this is in 1953. So that's the peak. But we also see a lot of things not changing. We see that Muslims are still not hired in the public sector. We see the laws that ban non-Turks from certain positions still not being repealed. And yet, Jews continue to express sentiments that are in favor of the DP. For example, one Jewish merchant says, quote, "The regime of Celal Bayar has given me my honor back. In all of my actions and in face of every situation, I now feel self-respect. The burden that has gone along with being a minority has been lifted from my shoulders. This is a tremendous blessing." So that is a huge endorsement of the change in government. That even the status of being a minority has become lighter by the change in the government. And the other major change in the Jewish situation of this time is a massive material improvement. We see throughout the 50s, we see the floor of material conditions rising in Turkey for everyone, including Jews. So the poorest classes of Jews become better off. They're able to afford more things, just as every other Turkish person is. And that again underlines their support for the DP. And the Jews were not exceptional in their relationship with the DP. Menderes also had a relationship with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Athenagoras, and visited other minority communities. And yet, we see the continuation of the assimilationism. For example, the education minister of the DP, who's in power at the time, giving a speech where he is promoting a continuation of the Citizen Speak Turkish campaign. The pressures on Jews specifically to start speaking Turkish at every situation, including in their homes and in their synagogues, continued throughout this period. The education minister in his speech says, quote, "Our mission is to spread the Turkish language and to use local products. We began to work some 20 years ago to ensure that every citizen would speak Turkish. We have the right to demand this of those who would avail themselves of all of our rights of citizenship." And then he gets to Jews specifically. "Around the house in Kuzguncuk, where I was a guest, I always hear the language spoken by the sons of Israel. We have occupied ourselves with this question greatly, but we have left it half finished. These persons who say, 'I'm Turkish,' and avail themselves of all the rights of Turkish citizenship, yet speak a foreign language all day long. How can they call themselves Turks?" So this is not too different from the position of the CHP in regards to language. The minister is saying they began the job and we're supposed to finish it. That everyone, especially Jews, are going to speak Turkish. So while the DP period provides some relief and high hopes, especially in regards to the return of the wealth tax, there is no return, and a lot of the racist laws are not repealed, and the overall framework of Turkishness continues. But we see in this time the added freedom bringing to the fore a new Jewish press. There had been a wave of Jewish newspapers after the 1908 revolution, and these had slowly died out in the 1920s, and some had survived into the early 30s. But we see in 1946, 47, 48, the beginning of a new, younger Jewish press led by younger people who are more excited to be involved in politics and to speak on Zionism specifically. And Shalom is one of these, Atikva is another, and there's Shabbat, and also Or Yehuda and Or Israel, the magazine. So these publications start throughout this period, achieve more than a few thousand readership each, basically serving their own community, published mostly in Ladino, but also in Turkish, as you can see here from the first page of Shabbat. One part of it is in Ladino, and another part is in Turkish. And often the Turkish parts are where the community wants to communicate with the wider public, when they want to call out an anti-Semitic column in a different paper, when they want to congratulate a national holiday like they're doing here, to show their Turkishness, or to defend themselves in the public eye. But when the community is talking to itself, they're still using Ladino in this time. And this will change throughout this period. And as I mentioned, the new Jewish press is really talking a lot about Zionism, because it seems that the younger people at the time are excited about this idea. And they're excited about the possibility of moving to a place where they become normal as Jews. And we see the community starting to split into a dual personality. One where often inside they're intrigued by the idea of Zionism, they're interested in moving, but outside they are often reluctant to say so. They don't want to draw attention to themselves as possibly disloyal to Turkey and loyal to another place. And we'll see this continue, and this has since become a common trope in Jewish communities across the world. Between 1946 and 1950, we see almost half the Jewish population leave Turkey. almost exclusively to Palestine. And Rafat Bari, who has an excellent book on specifically this mass migration, talks about how the community leadership tries to trivialize and make a non-story out of this event. But it's quite significant that of the 90,000 Jews who constituted the community in Turkey at the time, basically 40,000 leave within a few years to a country that isn't even established yet. And then when it is established, they continue leaving in droves. This newspaper clipping says a Jewish flood from Istanbul to Palestine, and mentions that 10,000 Jews have left already, and 30,000 are thought to be leaving. These numbers are massive, and it's really shocking to see what elites are saying in response to this. For example, Salomon Adato, the supposed Jewish voice in the DP, says that the mass migration is unimportant, and that it's small. It's just a few young thrill seekers who are going to join this war against the Arabs. And Eli Burla, one of the wealthiest people in the community, denied knowing about the migration at all, and said that the conditions of Jews was totally fine in Turkey, and he had no idea why anyone would choose to leave. And this is in stark contrast to the material reality. The people leaving are either a small group of younger, ideologically committed Zionists, or a large population of the Jewish underclass. The neighborhoods of Balat, especially, and Hasköy, more so than Galata, start emptying out. The people we talked about last time who were selling and buying rotten oranges, who were the urban poor of Istanbul, were trying to filter out to Palestine to seek a better life. So the idea that Adato called the migrants good for nothing thrill seekers was quite offensive to a major part of the community, and he was forced to retract that statement. But we see throughout this period that those who stay are at real pains to distance themselves from the migrants, because you see that the Turkish press becomes alarmed that the Jewish community is not loyal to Turkey, that Turkey, which is neutral in the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine, should have all of its citizens be neutral as well. But then in this Jewish press, and by voting with their feet, we see that the Jews aren't being neutral. They are supporting one side of this conflict, and that's become unacceptable to the Turkish elites. In columns throughout Turkish papers, they lament that Jews are abandoning Turkey, which they never saw as their homeland, and they're going to their true homeland. And of course, when they leave, they should have to leave their citizenship, and that they should be banned from ever returning, which actually does end up happening. The migration is in violation of Turkish law and caused many of the migrants to lose citizenship. And we see that after the migration, a lot of the elites are actually pleased because the community loses a lot of its lower middle class masses, and elites are hoping that they would become less conspicuous and higher class, and there would be, quote, less Ladino shouting in the streets, because the elites of the community is at this time speaking French at home more than Ladino, and they don't think of themselves as people who shout in the street. So in this time, we're really seeing this one inside voice, one outside voice become the reality of the Jewish mind, that the community itself is supportive of the Zionist idea, is interested in moving. Everyone starts having relatives that move. And this especially is the case in Izmir, where the community becomes extremely small after the mass migration. While in Istanbul, this is also stark, in Izmir, it's even starker. And the government tries to stop this migration. They put a ban on Jews getting passports, for example. in 1948, on November 1st, after the establishment of the state, the Turkish government decides that it does not like that its citizens are going off to join a war. So they put a ban on Jews getting passports, and Adato, whose party is in opposition, raises protest that this is against freedom of travel, but it doesn't really change the reality. And we see later on that Jews just get banned from getting on ships even, and yet they still find ways to go away. And an example of the Turkish press's reactions is from Vatan newspaper in October 1948, where one author says, "We could only be pleased that the Jewish, Armenian, and Greek minority citizens are held equal to those constituting the majority in every regard and enjoy all the same rights. However, we expect from these citizens a genuine loyalty to this land. In one word, we expect Turkishness. Among those whose Turkishness we do not doubt, there are still a number who appear Turkish on the outside, but in reality deem Palestine, Armenia, or Greece their homeland. To them, we say good riddance." So at this time, there's not really a major migration to Armenia or Greece. So this is clearly pointed at the Jewish migration. And we see that the Turkish author is recognizing that there are Jews who are speaking with two voices, that they maybe at home privately are interested in Palestine, but know that they'll be blamed as disloyal if they were to say that in public. But then when we come back to the Jewish press, these newspapers, Shabbat, Atikva, and Shalom, Shalom being the one that still exists today, we see them not shy away from supporting Palestine as a migration destination. We see them advertise boat trips and migration assistance companies. We even see that the Shabbat newspaper raffle off a ticket to Haifa, which gets the publisher into trouble with the police. But basically, we're seeing the continuation of the same sort of assimilationist idea and Turkishness, with a new twist that Jews now can and start going to a new place and leaving Turkey, and that it becomes evidence of their disloyalty. But the Turkish press doesn't seem to be comprehending a few things. One of them is the reality that the Jews were facing discrimination throughout the first decades of the Republic, unlike what they had experienced in the Ottoman period. The discrimination of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, especially the wealth tax, was a new experience to the Jewish community. And there was a second thing that the Jewish community was experiencing that the press didn't recognize, and that's the overwhelming destitution of the community. They saw no path for improvement of their lives. A lot of the employment paths were cut off to them. So eventually they decide maybe they're able to make a better life for themselves elsewhere. So these facts seem to elude the press because they go counter to the way they perceive themselves in the reality of Turkey. In the one-party era, this could be explained by censorship to some extent. So in 1948, this would be surprising because 46, the one-party period ends. The press becomes freer. So if a Turkish Muslim really recognized the reality of anti-Semitism and Jewish poverty, he could have expressed it. But we see that Sadun Savcı in this case and other writers are simply not comprehending this reality. It doesn't fit with their idea of Turkey. Shifting gears a little, I want to turn to the idea of the chief rabbinate, which we didn't get into last time, but basically part of the Turkification of the Jewish community was the destruction of communal institutions. We see the government banning the election of a new chief rabbi. So when Hayim Becerano, who had been acting as chief rabbi, dies in 1931, we're at a loss for leadership. We've got Rafael Saban, who's in the middle here, starts acting like a leading rabbi, but he's not really taking up the title of chief rabbi because the government doesn't recognize him as such, and the government doesn't let him take on the administering of of lands and property that comes with this title. So the true leadership of the community becomes transferred to the wealthy elites who become unelected and are part of this lay council that is established, though it's not recognized by the state and its elections are banned. So it's kind of on an honor system of who owns communal property and who administers it. And it just happens to become the unelected wealthy men of the community. And this is coupled with a massive loss of population from migration to Israel that leads to financial crisis. And leaders like Henry Soriano, who later becomes a parliamentarian, become the mastheads of the government, of the Jewish community for decades. They're basically running communal affairs from 1930 until 1950. And the new young press is calling out these old leaders and indeed forces them to step down. So in 1950, when the JIP is facing election against the Democrat Party, they do a favor to the Jewish community in order to win back some sympathy. And they allow the Jews to have an election for their lay council. The first meeting of the lay council since 1936. And the former MP, Samuel Abravaya, becomes elected as the new lay president. And shortly after, under the DP government in 1953, Aldato, a member of the government's party, negotiates with Menderes to allow the election of a chief rabbi officially. And there are 3 official candidates, which seems huge. Since then, we've not had that for any position in communal leadership. But 3 people run as candidates for the chief rabbinate, and the person who had been acting in the position, Rafael Saban, becomes elected, officially becoming the first chief rabbi of the Turkish Republic in 1953. And this is often by chance, as you can see, that the government allows for the election because of the upcoming election in 1950. And then they allow the election of the chief rabbi officially because of the interjection of Salomon Adato, who happens to be in government. And here you can see the member of the lay council, Salomon Adato himself, who orchestrated the elections, and the new chief rabbi visiting with the interior minister and later the Prime Minister Menderes. And that was a historic situation. And then in this meeting, we also see that the chief rabbi visits the Ankara Jewish community, which we didn't really talk about. It's a smaller population, and he just sees that this community is having trouble leading itself and is being suffocated under this Republican city where they're often not allowed to do most of the jobs, because most of the jobs in Ankara have to do with public works. And while the general atmosphere of the DP era until now that I've been describing is one of excitement and change, there's also a continuation of the negatives, at least. And we see this in maybe the most important event for us in this period that we're looking at. In the 1946-1980 period, the most important distinct event is the Istanbul Pogrom of 1955. So right in the 5th year, in the middle of the 10-year reign of the Democrat Party, we see this massive pogrom breakout in Istanbul. And we know it's organized. We know it's premeditated. A newspaper publishes an evening edition, the Istanbul Express, where the headline is, "Greeks have bombed the childhood home of Ataturk in Salonika." This, of course, is untrue, but it becomes the pretext of a pogrom against the Greeks of Istanbul, who happen to live mostly in this neighborhood of Beyoğlu. And here you can see Istiklal Street on the day after. And this is happening on the night of September 6th, 1955. And during this pogrom, there are various pillagings and destruction of property and homes. and they try to burn many homes of minorities. And one 65-year-old Jewish man who's a watchman is murdered. His name is Avram Anav. He worked for a company named Motola, one of the famous Jewish stores in the area in Beyoğlu. He's murdered by the mob. So some first-person accounts of this event. I'm going to start with the one at the bottom because it really explains why this is not simply an anti-Greek riot. So after the next day, Ben-Sion Pinto, who becomes the president of the community later, goes to Vitali Hakko, a famous Jewish merchant, and says, Vitali, how come your store is destroyed too? Wasn't all this against Greek stores? And he looked at my face and said, what Greek, what Jew, what Armenian? Basically, these differences of, oh, who is a Christian, who is a Jew, didn't matter. All that mattered is that you were not a Turkish Muslim. And of the 4,359 workplaces that were destroyed, 523 belonged to Jews. So that's 12% of all the destroyed businesses, let alone the homes and the people murdered and beaten. Here we see a double Jewish whammy of the store Dario and also the Luxembourg apartment, both owned by Jews, being destroyed during the pogrom. And the pogrom's effects are felt across the country by all different communities, by Jews, Armenians, and Greeks in other parts of Turkey, start being harassed in the aftermath by Turks who say, see, your time is up. And we see this especially in Çanakkale, a town in Thrace that still has a Jewish community after the pogrom of 1934, where threats are made by posters on trees around the town saying that Jews should leave. And people in Istanbul in the days after report seeing swastikas on their doors. And in response, the government does symbolically shut down one of the popular anti-Semitic publications, but this doesn't stop the population from keeping migrating. So in the next 2 years, in 1956 and 57, we see between 4,000 and 5,000 more Jews leave the country. And the events of this night are horrific, especially for the Greek community, but we see that Jews also witness major trauma. So the first oral history that I'm going to share is from a woman who was a child at the time, and she said, they tore Beyoğlu apart. It was a disaster. Of course, I was little, I was scared. We had a balcony and I hid in the corner there. The next day, my mom took me out to Beyoğlu, to this street, basically. It was still a mess. Fabrics, fridges, everything was on the ground all over. And this girl at the time was living right next to that neighborhood where a lot of Jews lived around La Kula, the Galata Tower. The second quote is from my own grandfather, who lived in Osman Bey. And a Greek grocer across from us, another Greek, a coal and log seller on the corner. They destroyed all of it that night. There were mostly minorities in that neighborhood. So we see a lot of stories of this night where Turkish doormen save an apartment building that has mostly minorities in it. We see some people just leave their homes out of fear, including Ben-Sion Pinto, who left his home fearing for his life on that night. So the trauma of this pogrom continues as well, and it's one of the more famous events, I would say, of Turkish history against minorities. In contrast to the wealth tax, for example, this is definitely way more known. And we see on this night most of the Greek churches being desecrated and burned. We see many Greek cemeteries being desecrated, people playing soccer with skulls in these cemeteries. So this is truly an event that wipes out a lot of the goodwill that the government had with minorities, because of course the police do nothing to stop this. The newspaper who printed the lie isn't then reprimanded. And clearly there was some collaboration with state apparatuses. And then we see the end of the Democrat Party regime, unrelated to the minority policies, of course. But when the 1960 coup happens and Menderes is arrested, we see the Jewish community being really afraid because they were perhaps the most outspoken Democrat Party supporters. So they were afraid of repercussions, and they leave the two then MPs of DP out on the cold, basically. The community doesn't support them. They distance themselves from them, especially Altabev, Isacc Altabev, who was a community leader, wasn't really involved in politics, wasn't a DP man. The community had asked him to be the representative in the government. And then he gets arrested and is tried for treason, along with Yusuf Salman, a more believing DP supporter. Yusuf Salman dies just as the case is starting for unrelated reasons. Altabev is sentenced to prison and is sent to prison in Kayseri. He is later released, but shortly dies as well. So their stories are really tragic in comparison to the previous DP government. The community's treatment of them, while understandable, is quite sad. And the post-coup government brings the CHP and El Sodro İnönü back to power. We see some things change for the Jews. We see the government's legal requirement for Turkishness for public employment finally abolished. But again, after 1960, we see thousands of Jews, 3,000 to 8,000, mostly of the lower classes and the lower middle classes, continuing to leave, again from Istanbul, but also from all over Turkey, especially from Izmir. Basically, the Izmir community is going through the largest population decrease. And we see the continuation of the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign throughout the 60s as well. Just as it was picked up in the 50s, it is again picked up in the 60s by the new government. And we see the coup government disband the Lake Council that was so hardly reinstated in 1950 because it was an autonomous organizing that the state did not want to exist. That Jews cared for their own sick and their poor. They operated a summer camp for their own kids on Burgaz Island. We see that the government has issues with the Jews becoming an autonomous, institutionalized community. So they start shutting down some of these organizations and programs. We also see MPs, again, say that Jews control the economy and that this is a problem in Turkey. And that kind of rhetoric we're gonna start seeing from the Islamists. The Islamism as a political ideology, that Islam is a way to organize society, was not really en vogue in Republican Turkey of 1920, 30, 50, or 40. But in the 50s, we see that it's becoming popular in some parts of the country, in some sectors. And we see Islamist populations that are rife with anti-Semitism crop up in the 50s and become more popular in the 60s. And in 1970, we see the first Islamist party led by this man, Necmettin Erbakan, who is a virulent anti-Semite. His National Order Party becomes the first political party that, according to Rifat Bali, is one that makes anti-Semitism an inseparable part of its political rhetoric. And this is what's new about this party. Anti-Semitism happened from members of the CHP, the first government, or the Democrat Party, but it wasn't really a part and parcel of their political ideology or rhetoric. But with the Islamists, it is unimaginable without it. That is part and parcel of their ideology. So this is just one quote from Erbakan that I thought I would share. The Jews started 19 crusades. The 19th was World War I. Why? Just so they could build Israel. He's really direct in saying that everyone who is against Turkey are Jews, and Jews control America, and everyone who cooperates with them in Turkey are collaborators and secret Jews and crypto Jews and all that sort of thing. And we see this get especially bad after the 1967 war, when Israel wins against the Arabs, because this becomes a huge cause for anti-Semitic press. At this time, the idea of Islamic solidarity becomes more popular, and it hadn't been in 1948. For example, when my grandfather went to the clinic he worked at as a doctor, as a resident doctor, the day after the war, his presiding surgeon says, what did your people do? And he's referring to the war. And my grandfather said, my people did nothing. We live in Istanbul. We're not involved in this. But of course, the Turkish public doesn't think so. And after 67, we see Islamists and Islamic-aligned publications call for declaration of Jews as persona non grata. We see swastikas appear in Gelibolu. And in addition to the Islamists, we also see the rise of the Turkish far-right nationalists at the time, who are really interested in the ideas and methods of the Nazis. So that's why we're seeing all these swastikas crop up, because the far-right nationalists are learning from the Nazi experience. They're reading Mein Kampf, which becomes a very popular book in Turkey. And after a attempted arson at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, we see the beginning of a, quote, week of solidarity with Al-Aqsa and cursing of the Jews in Turkey. The Islamist press is supportive of this. They have marches and parades where they curse Jews. They burn a Star of David in front of a store owned by Vitali Hakko in Beyoğlu. And someone who then in more recent years becomes a dean of a theology faculty said of his activities at the time, quote, in our sermons at the Friday mosque, all the mosques were linked by loudspeaker. We would have frequently speak against the Jews. My friend Hikmet Salcan Bey and I would frequently repeat claims that conducting commerce with the Jews was aiding the enemy, that any Muslim who bought from the Jews was putting ammunition in the weapons of the enemy. So we see boycotts of Jews become popular. And these, on the basis not of nationalism of Turkey, but of Islamic solidarity with Arabs and Palestinians. And this is a new development in the Turkish public and its version of anti-Semitism. So this is the environment that is pushing Jewish migration, basically. But none of this is coming only from extreme right-wing Islamists or nationalists. We see this also come from the Turkish revolutionary left. One such organization, the Turkish People's Liberation Front Army, has their first action in 1971 be the abduction of the Israeli Consul General in Istanbul, Ephraim Elram, and they end up murdering him because the government doesn't meet their demands. And the fact that they not only did this action, but that they would do this as their first action underlines some of the problems that the revolutionary left has with anti-Semitism. The idea that Israel is a colonial outpost and Jews in Turkey are associated with it, and the sort of European late 19th century, early 20th century idea that capitalism is controlled by Jews and so on, kind of infects the Turkish revolutionary left at the time. And we see attacks crop up as well. So the Navi Shalom Synagogue, which was built in the 50s, is attacked by a bomb in 1969, which this is a synagogue that has been attacked many times. So this one is often forgotten because it was a bomb that was dropped at 3:30 a.m. So it didn't really hurt anyone, and it caused minor damage to the building. But nonetheless, we see the beginning of violence against Jewish communal institutions. So that's kind of progressing from attacks on individual Jewish homes and businesses, which we have seen in Istanbul and in Thrace, to direct attacks that are more symbolic in nature against Jews to scare them to leave, basically. And often we see it working. And we see at this time increasing political violence. So these Islamists and the revolutionary left that is forming and the far-right nationalists, maybe above all, are mostly armed. And there's shootouts on the street on many of the days throughout the 1970s and also the late 60s. We see universities keep getting shut down for political violence. And of course, many Jews are affected by this, trying to get an education. They have to be sent home, their programs get longer, their education gets more delayed, and they're afraid to go into certain neighborhoods or to talk to certain people, grow a certain type of mustache or cut their mustache short, because these are all signs of your political leaning. And this environment of chaos is put to an end / exacerbated at the same time by the 1980 coup, which takes a lot of this violence and hides it in prisons. We see the explosion of torture in Turkey after the 1980 coup, which it had already existed. And we see this harm almost every sector of the Turkish public. And I'm going to end with some quotes from the report of the Israeli Consul General at the time, Yehuda Levit, who was posted in Istanbul and kind of summarizes the problems we're talking about. And in that first part, I want to especially underline that last part, that Jews live within a strange fear. They hadn't had persecution like this in the Ottoman Empire, and they had it for the first part of the Republic. And then they tried to avoid it at all cost in the 46-80 period that we're talking about today. They tried to become less conspicuous. They tried to become more assimilated. They tried to do whatever the government wants just so they can be left alone. And those who don't want to do that, or those who think that won't pay off, just tend to leave. And that's how we end up with a community that is half the size that it was in the beginning of this period. So when we reach 1980, the community has dropped from 90,000 towards 30,000. And we see this being recognized at the time by Levitt, who says, Jewish youth have begun to assimilate into Turkish culture. This is manifest first and foremost, exclusive use both inside and on the street of the Turkish language. And we see the decline of Ladino basically in this time as a language of Jews. We see that the press that we've been reading about, the Shabbat, the Shalom, the Atikva, print more and more in Turkish on Jewish internal matters, because the youth of the Jewish community becomes more familiar with the Turkish language than the Jewish. Remember from last time that the schools are almost exclusively in Turkish. So of course the youth are only learning Ladino at home, if that, or learning French if they're upper class. But they're also trying to shake those accents and those languages so that they can become better citizens who will realistically face less discrimination, but also possibly have more opportunities for work. And by the end of this period that we're talking about, most of the community doesn't speak any Jewish language at home, or French. They speak Turkish. They speak Turkish to their friends. They speak Turkish even if they're in Jewish school. And in oral histories that I've conducted, this is one of the questions that I ask throughout, like when we're talking about their childhood, what language did you speak to people at the time? And then when we're talking about high school, what language did you speak to people at the time? And you see that in the 40s, 50s, people were speaking Ladino to their families and friends. And then in the 60s, people were trying to speak Turkish at home and definitely were speaking Turkish to their friends. And in the 70s and 80s, it was just over, that people were speaking Turkish to their friends, to their children, to their grandchildren. So this is really the crux of where the language goes from being the majority to the minority of the community. So I think we can end there. I've just thrown a lot of stuff at you, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so we can stop there.
Thank you so much, Nesi. We'll open up questions to the floor. If you have a question you would like to ask, please enter it into the chat box, and we'll read it out loud for Nesi to try to answer, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the amount of time we have. So Nesi, a question to open with, you mentioned, it was very fascinating. First of all, thank you so much for a really great talk. You mentioned, sorry, one second. You mentioned the issue of kind of this gap in leadership, in not a lack of people, but more of a lack of recognition. And I'm curious how you can maybe comment on that lack of recognition impacted the internal dynamics of the Jewish community a bit more. Particularly, you know, I'm personally very fascinated by the Rabbanut and the leading rabbis in Turkey, and I've read quite a bit about Rabbi Saban and how he was not only a great, you know, Talmid Chacham, a really wise and kind and down-to-earth rabbi, he was also a pragmatic rabbi. He knew kind of how to navigate the politics of his time at a point in time in which he needed to know to deal with certain things in the community. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, the religious leadership was still there when the government didn't recognize the rabbinate. So Saban from 31 to 53 is still deciding the boundaries of kashrut, or still saying decisions on marriages, mixed marriages, divorces, stuff like that. That's still continuing. It's the representing the community to the wider public and administering of communal funds and communally owned buildings that's the problem, because those things require outside recognition. Within the community acts like they have a chief rabbi because there's a rabbi who's the leader who they like. So that's not really shaping the internal dynamics. The internal dynamics are more shaped by the wealthy industrialists who become the spokespeople. And we see in the young press that this is resented, that they don't like to be led by lay people who are unelected. And they would rather be led by elected lay people, or if that's not possible, elected religious leaders. And we see that the government is in favor of that as well. The government is in favor of having one religious leader be the only representative and not have a lay leader at all. And this is the case for the other communities. For example, the Armenians or the Greeks, even until today, basically, don't have any lay leadership structures. They're only representatives of their patriarchs. But with the Jewish community, there's always been this undercurrent and then clear recognition of a secular leadership.
I have a question here. I think it's a good question. One question is asking when you're going to write a book about the Jews of the Turkish Republic. I think there's a lot of demand for this now, certainly. And
soon. In the meantime, I recommend the work of Rafat Bali immensely, who obviously throughout this series, I owe him a lot. His work is really pioneering.
So the follow-up question was any books you'd recommend about Jews in the Republican period?
Yeah, so for any publications in terms of English, I would say Rafat Bali's Multi-Party Democracy. He has a series. So there's Early Republic, Mass Migration to Israel, and Multi-Party Democracy, which is 1950 to present for him, because 46 to 50 covers as mass migration to Palestine. So I'd recommend those 3 books for sure.
Next question, can you comment on what was behind the 1980 coup in Turkey? Or what was believed to be behind it?
So there were many factors, but the political violence was the main excuse/cause. The governments were becoming increasingly unstable because the coalition politics was not working out. The electorate was extremely split. The person who asked this could email me and we could discuss this further, because the 1980 coup is maybe the most studied thing of modern Turkey because it really shapes the reality we live in today. We still today live under the post-coup constitution. The 1982 constitution is what we have today still. So it's really central.
And now kind of jumping back a bit to the Israeli relationship, maybe you can comment on what was the relationship between the Turkish government and the Israeli government up to 1967 during the 6-Day War.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I didn't really get to cover it all. Basically, Turkey is really cautious about this conflict because the government knows that the public is more sympathetic to the Arabs, even though there's not really like the idea that Islamic solidarity isn't really taken hold yet. So we see Turkey hold out on recognition until 1949. And we see the young Jewish press really push for recognition of Israel. We see the Israeli War of Independence being compared to the Turkish War of Independence in the Jewish press. So when recognition finally happens, we see the Jewish community celebrating. That's what the picture was from, with the wreaths with the Turkish and Israeli flags. We see lots of Jews go visit the hoisting of the flag when the consulate opens in 49. People take their kids, and it's an event. It's a memorable day for the community. The Turkish relationship with Israel is obviously cold, but not antagonistic at all. Turkey is a part of the Western Alliance, and so is Israel. So that's their level of relationship, I would say.
And now, can you comment a little bit about first what happened to Solomon Adato after the DP transition, and two, maybe speak about kind of this very fascinating development of both this anti-Semitism on the left and the right, because we don't see this very often in kind of the Jewish world, into the Western European world. We kind of see it a lot more in recent days. We've seen it a lot more with anti-Semitism on the right and the left. But Turkey seems like the exception in terms of developing it early on, even in the 40s and the 50s.
Solomon Adato unfortunately dies in a plane accident in 1954, I want to say, after the establishment of the chief rabbinate again in 1953. So he is gone too soon. He had way more to do, and he was very passionate about his work, but unfortunately he died young in 1954 when his plane crashed. In terms of, what was the other question?
Regarding this kind of weird dynamic of the left anti-Semitism in addition to the traditional right.
So these revolutionary leftist groups are not electoralists. They're not running in parties. They're not in any formal organization. They're all illegal guerrilla fighters. So that's important to underline. And they're often being trained by people, the PLFP, a leftist Palestinian group in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley. So they're being armed by these people as well. They have mutual aid networks with them. And of course, that informs their ideas of Jews and Israel. And they bring those ideas back to Turkey, where often they have not interacted with the Jews before because the community is so insular. So they see our community as a continuation of this colonial outpost, basically.
And now another question here. Were there many instances of Jews converting to Islam during the Republican period, either forced conversion or tactical conversion to avoid persecution?
I don't think there were any, because we know from the experience of the Dönme, who are the people who followed Sabbatai Sevi and became Muslims, that nominal conversion to Islam does not solve anti-Semitism. If you're pegged as descendant from Jews, you face anti-Semitism still. So that would not be a good tactic.
And actually, we have someone here, our dear friend Rochelle Amado-Bodnik, who is originally from Izmir, and she actually wanted to comment on the note you mentioned, particularly about the mass migration from Izmir and about her experiences being teased. Rochelle, I just try to unmute you if you want to try to say your comment. Let's see. Rochelle?
I am mute. Thank you so much. Okay, I just want to say that I saw the mass migration from Izmir. I was there, waited in the port for the ships to come in. They were coming from Istanbul to pick up the people from Izmir to take them, and sometimes there wasn't enough room. So the ship that was supposed to pick them up didn't stop, or stopped but didn't take them in. And it was a real unforgettable scene of that mass migration. But what I wanted to comment is that as you were talking, I remembered that as we when they instituted voluntary religion classes in the elementary schools, kids could stay after school and take classes on Islam, but Jewish and non-Muslim kids didn't have to, or Muslim kids who didn't want to didn't have to, but they all stayed, and we left. And so there would be kids outside telling us, Jew, go to Palestine, Filistin'e git. And it's interesting to me that now they are chanting, get out of Palestine. You know, it's at that time they really, but you know, what is amazing to me is that in spite of all those hard times, which you put together, people from Turkey have a love for Turkey. We miss that beautiful country, and some of us didn't experience much of what you talked about firsthand. You know, some of the worst. You know, like the pogroms in Thrace. You know, those kinds of things we didn't see in Izmir, and generally maybe we were a little better off in Izmir because the community was not as big, and in our schools we really had no problem with our classmates or anything, you know. So having been away from Turkey much more than I was in it, the general feeling is still nostalgia for that land. And I find this for people who've gone to Israel and in other places also. Despite of bad memories, somehow the good memories prevail, I would say, at least the people I know in general.
Thank you for sharing. I think especially about the thing about you said about school, where you don't remember a bad experience because you were getting along with people. I think that is something that's true of this period of people who lived in areas where there were a lot of minorities, because you go to school and you're not the only Jew. You're among many Jews, and there's Armenians, and there's Greeks. So there's strength in numbers. And we see that go away in the 70s and 80s, unfortunately.
We have one or two last questions here. One from Alan. How much, what were the rates of intermarriage between Muslims and Christians, if at all, during this period with Jews?
I don't want to say anything because I don't know specifically, but I'd say there's probably more than the intermarriage between Jews and Muslims, because that at the time is extremely low. And it's a topic that the Chief Rabbi Saban is particularly interested in. He's really interested in what Jewish law has to say about mixed marriages. But I'm not sure of the state of intermarriage between Christians and Muslims, but I'm gonna assume it was unusual.
Maybe you could also comment on the political role in which Jews and government played. We see in the Ottoman period, and towards the end of the Ottoman period, we see quite a robust role from a number of Jewish parliamentarians and kind of close counselors to the government. And then we kind of see this dip, and then we see this rise again in terms of Jewish kind of activism in government. Maybe you can comment a little bit about that, why we see the kind of rise and dip.
So this is something that so the story of Jewish support and advice to the government, especially in terms of foreign policy, is going to become important in the 70s and 80s, which I didn't get into today, but I'm going to talk about next week, because it really picks up in the 80s. But it begins in the 70s, in the period that I was talking about today, that Jews become a PR group for Turkey outside of the country, because this is the time when the suppression of Kurds is becoming a public issue in and outside of Turkey. The issue of Armenian genocide denial is becoming a robust thing for the first time, because up until this time it was mostly ignored. But now we're seeing diaspora Armenians start talking about it, so then Turkey has to talk about it outside as well. And Jews become a good foil for these issues. because they, for example, Jacques Camhi, a community leader at the time, can go to the American Jewish Committee or the ADL and say, oh, like, we're doing fine. Turkey's so tolerant. It always has been. So we should all deny the Armenian genocide. We're going to get into that story more next week. So stay tuned.
Maybe last question, and kind of on the note regarding Turkish-Jewish relations outside of the country, maybe you can comment on if you know about any relationships that developed during the Republican period, or at least that were maintained with the diasporic Turkish Jewish community in the United States, in Israel, in Mexico, in Argentina. Are there any formal relationships between the community there? Was there any issues of need for economic or social or political support? Maybe you could speak to that if you can.
So that's a good question. The relationship with Israel is the most robust, of course, because everyone is leaving at a time when communication is much easier, and because of the physical proximity. So people go and visit, they come and go, they talk on the phone, they wait to talk on the phone for hours, and there's more communication. With the relationship with those who had left for the US, Devin Nair actually has a good article about this called Turkinos Beyond the Empire. And that relationship basically fades into the 30s. And by this time has kind of gone away, I would say.
Okay, with that, we want to keep in mind time, especially as in that Nesi is currently in Istanbul. So we really greatly appreciate him staying up very late for us on the East and the West Coast of the United States. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nesi. I apologize for everybody who we couldn't get to your questions. Please feel free to hold them or email them to us or Nesi.
Yeah, please email me.
Yeah.
It's my name and last name @gmail.
So Nesi Altaras @gmail.com. Very simple, very straightforward. And if you have any problems, let us know if you have trouble finding it. I want to thank Nesi again so much for putting on this new 3-part series with us these past weeks. I want to thank the Ben Ezra family for sponsoring the first class in this series. Thank you so much. I believe they're actually from Turkey originally, so they're really wonderful to have them sponsor. If you're interested in sponsoring a program, we do rely on your support. Please consider sponsoring one of our classes or series through the Sephardic Digital Academy. If you're interested, please email us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com. Nesi, thank you so much again. And inshallah, Sekir al-Dio, we should see you all next Thursday night, 8:30 p.m. out of Vermos. Thank you.